It is, Joel. Let's be real. I am medium intelligent at best. And even though I'm interested in lots of different things, I often need to talk to guests like we have on the show today, Elaine Dezenski, to figure out why my blind faith in some idea that I am championing, like reindustrialization and manufacturing growth in the US, is not dumb. So this conversation is going to get really high level into a lot of global politics and trade policies. That's a good thing to ground a lot of this in some practical realities, because it's one thing to tilt towards this windmill and say we need to build more stuff in the US, and I intend to keep doing that. But it's also good to learn from people that are working at the policy level, the analysis level, the think tank level, like Elaine. And I really appreciate her coming on Tool or Die and talking to me and Alex. There's so much good stuff here. So thanks for tuning in, as always. And here is Elaine Dezenski. All right, Elaine, you're explaining to me your thoughts on Zihan's latest book. What is that book called again? I did read it, but it was on audiobook. It didn't stick.
Yeah, it's great. It's called The End of the World is Just the Beginning.
So Peter Zihan is what, a geopolitical analyst? I think he worked for Stratfor for a while.
Yeah.
But he is very pro reindustrialization and really believes the U.S. is set up for the next century.
Yeah, this book is sort of mind blowing. If for those folks who haven't read it, it's definitely worth a look. It's a long read, and this came out in 2022. That book, and it really, in a way, it sort of foretells what's happening right now, which is kind of a breakup of the global order as we know it. And he talks about the order, and that's with a capital O, as the American-led Pax Americana global peace, which is fundamentally underpinned by the strength and dominance of the U.S. Navy. And
that was a big framing I took back from it, is that the shipping lanes having been kept in operation by the U.S. for 70 years is really a bigger factor than we normally count on.
Yeah, and that has, to our forthcoming conversation on supply chains, it's that underpinning of open and safe seas that has allowed production to take place in so many geographies. But without that, the production environment is going to look very, very different. So I think we could debate whether the U.S. is moving away from that role of maritime dominance, or if it's actually moving more towards that goal. I think we see some examples of both, but this book goes on to, talk about what does a new global order look like, if not for American dominance, and the breakup across regions and countries is stark, and the implications for agriculture, for production, for the ability of countries to source for the things that they need, becomes rather dire. In many situations, there are clear winners and losers in this breakup. But another thing that I really took away from this, and maybe we can touch on it in our supply chain discussion, is that North America is actually pretty well positioned, even in a broken order, because we have agricultural independence and because we have energy independence. And without those two things, along with fresh water, it's really going to be dire. So anyway, so lots to think about with the Zihan book and others that have come out. Michael Pettis's book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, is really interesting. And that whole conversation about trade deficit versus trade surplus, what that really means. And, he puts countries like China and Germany in the same bucket when it comes to trade surplus. And he's right. We're talking about countries that, have generated capacity well beyond what they can manage domestically as a strategy. And the U.S. becomes the not only the consumer of last resort, but also the place for surplus savings to come in the form of treasuries, right? So it's this dynamic that he argues is going to be a death spiral for us unless we can push out of that and move towards a more balanced trade regime, which also implies more industry, more productive capacity in the U.S.
We talk a lot about nearshoring versus bringing, reindustrialization, bringing things back to the U.S.
Yeah.
Do you think that the shipping is a factor? I do also think, which is to say, why Mexico perhaps is a better place to put things if you are still trying to offshore. Do you think that the shipping is a factor? And do you also think this is a little sideways, but the thought that kept coming in my mind when Trump came into office and was saber rattling Canada and Greenland is
Mhm.
that it was less about the Canada stuff. I felt like was just a good old fashioned troll, but Greenland, everybody talks about
Right.
rare earths, and I often have been wondering if there are plans in Washington and people that are looking at a lot of things for a hotter Earth where the Arctic sea lanes open up, and that we'll be able to start using those as shipping lanes as well. Is that still crazy sci-fi stuff, or is that like the kind of things that analysts that work for organizations like yours consider at this point?
Well, I'll say that we haven't really made the connection between climate, Arctic, and mining in a sort of a research capacity. But let's come back to that in a minute. I want to. Your question is great, and it has a couple different parts. So
Are you a manufacturer drowning in orders, juggling inventory and procurement data across multiple systems, or managing production manually? Then you may want to take a look at today's sponsor, DOS. DOS is an adaptive ERP that kills implementation hell by working directly with your team, connecting all your systems to minimize data entry so you can focus on production. Instead of barging in like a bull in a china shop, they take a deep look at your actual operations and they build a system that matches how you operate today, placing only the parts that need improving rather than trying to fix what's already working great. Does that sound like a team that you could actually enjoy working with? If so, head over to DOS.com, DOSS.com, use the link in the show notes, or tell them that Joel from Tool or Die sent you. DOS.com, one platform, total visibility.
I think the long story short on shipping doesn't matter in the context of nearshoring, risk management, strategies to pivot, strategies for ally shoring, which is how I've been writing about the kind of the requirement really to get out of authoritarian regimes for critical supply chains. Yeah, shipping matters. It matters a lot. I think there's the possibility that there will be a lot of challenges in the Indo-Pacific trying to keep essential trade lanes open. I think we should just expect that that's going to be the case. So there's a risk management imperative to really think about, what does it mean to bring production home or closer to home? Say what you will about the US economy and where we are in trade and tariffs, we're still the dominant economy and we're still the dominant consumers. So if I were thinking about, well, do I want to pivot to a place like Mexico in the current environment? Okay, with the tariff conversation and the questions about the reauthorization or the review, I should say, of the USMCA, U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, that does bring some instability into the discussion. But I'm pretty bullish on North America and Mexico in particular. I think we are now integrated in a way that is not only difficult to undo. We have a lot of co-production, as you know, with Mexico and Canada, but it's detrimental to both sides of the borders if we unwind that co-production. Why? What's the point? If the co-production is resulting in a new job in Mexico and a new job in the U.S. and potentially a new job in Canada, what's the downside? I think that co-production model is a force to be reckoned with, and we will eventually get back to that. Right now, we're at a different stage in this whole, you know, economic showdown. It's more about getting all countries to the table. And it's really testing this notion of what it means to be an ally versus what it means to be aligned. And I think with this administration, it's more about this question of alignment and that we can kind of redefine this notion of an ally or an economic ally in terms of how aligned a country is with the new US objective around balancing trade, reindustrialization, ally shoring. I still think we're going to see a lot of US investment in certain countries, but it's going to be much more targeted. So that's a little bit on the nearshoring and ally shoring. Going back to the Arctic, I mean, that's really the new battleground, I think. Yeah, I mean, it's already getting warmer. It's already getting easier to send the breakers up and to, look for these new trade lanes. And China's all over this, Russia's all over this. It's kind of like we don't really talk about it as ground zero for this free world versus authoritarian uh, tension, but boy, it's there.
I'm curious. So there were a number of years, China was deploying the Belt and Road Initiative, and then I think it's starting about 24 months ago, a number of stories came out about how they were having difficulty supporting it, and some of the countries in which they had built infrastructure were getting very aggravated with its deployment. What is the current state of the Belt and Road Initiative, really?
So that's a great question. So China is the single largest debtor in the world, which means more countries are more in debt to China than any other nation. A lot of that is through the BRI, not exclusively, but that's a big chunk of it. So it depends on how you think about the Belt and Road Initiative and how you view the objectives. Sometimes it's cast as a geopolitical initiative. Initially, when it was first launched, it was more of, under this development framework and critical infrastructure. I would look at it in the following way. It's been a boon for Chinese political and economic coercion. The fact that a lot of countries are now in debt and have either faulty infrastructure, half built projects, other challenges, state capture through huge corruption that was facilitated through the BRI. All of this is, in a way, these were risks that China was willing to take on because they wanted to have this expansion to create new trade opportunities, to be able to get access to rare earths, agriculture, and utilize their leverage politically in the UN, which has actually worked really well. So there have been some successes, I think, if we look at it from that sort of geopolitical angle. China's probably achieved quite a bit with the BRI, but they haven't built as much goodwill as they expected. And a lot of these countries are starting to rethink. The US is finally waking up to this challenge. And China has, because of its own economic challenges, it has moved away from funding these big infrastructure projects. So a lot of what we saw in the early days, 10 to 15 years ago, were the big investments in ports, rail lines, big infrastructure, bridges, and the like. Now we see more of what she calls small but beautiful projects. So, the narrative, like, what's yes. Anyway, so I would sort of interpret that as meaning, more closely aligned with the strategic objectives of the Chinese Communist Party. So digital infrastructure, surveillance equipment,
Just one gorge dam.
yeah, exactly, exactly. The kinds of investments that still make sense, even if the loans never get repaid.
One of the more interesting components of Belt Road, it seems like some of these stories about the infrastructure they built, have led to, and then the failures of some of that infrastructure have led to resentment and anger in some of those countries. And I was trying to look back at the analogs of American history in the 20th century, and it seemed that as the United States was investing in South America, along with that, those investments came American soft power, cultural power. And
Yeah.
so even when some of the projects went sideways and there were some issues with debt and resentment, there was still like a vestigial love of the United States for its cultural soft power. It's not
Yeah.
apparent to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the Chinese have paired Belt of Road with a parallel soft power or cultural things that those countries might cling to buy them more time to resolve the friction in the BRI.
I think they've focused on the elites in a lot of these countries, with the idea of more of that, economic coercion, bribing, focusing on projects that advance the vanity objectives of certain governments. There's been that sort of engagement, which has been more of a focus than building broader goodwill throughout these countries and societies. I think it's very difficult with their model on the one hand because they import a lot of the material and a lot of the labor. So when you do that, you don't have the opportunity to really make the connections at the local level. And sometimes what you end up setting up in these projects is a competitive framework for local business. So there are, for example, diaspora in certain African countries, Chinese diaspora, many of whom have come, to work on BRI projects. They stay. They may not have valid visas at that point, but there's a local ecosystem that sets up around that. And then a lot of Chinese low value goods are imported into that country to serve the needs of that diaspora, creating competition for the local merchants. So these sorts of dynamics have not really worked, as much to their benefit. And it's why if you look at some of the polling, particularly in Africa, you'll see that the Chinese are not that well regarded in the, across the general populace, given the amount of investment that has been made. So they do talk about people to people engagement, and they do have a softer side of the BRI work, but I don't think it's been that impactful.
Let's talk about ally shoring as your coinage, which I actually think has a place still as a term versus nearshoring or friendshoring, as as the Biden administration tried to call it. Because of your earlier point, there is a difference between near and ally.
Yeah.
What is your perspective? Well, I was going to say a global view, but that's kind of the question entirely, right? Everything's sort of switching into a hemispheric and regional view. But what is your general take an ideal situation as we try to move production out of autocratic countries? Where would you like to see the what's the best case scenario that you'd like to see?
Thank you for that fantastic question. So first, I want to start with the definition of ally shoring, because as it was envisioned when my longtime colleague John Austin and I started writing about the idea in 2020, it was about building a fundamentally different economic framework amongst allies and partners, one that would be rooted in democratic machinations, if you will. And that means rule of law, it means transparency, it means free and open competition, all the things that we want to see in an ideal marketplace. This was really the opportunity as we were going through COVID and really understanding the level of dependency on suppliers like China and how bad it was in the early days of COVID. Now, of course, we know those supply chain dependencies on a much deeper level. So, this notion of co production that we were talking about earlier, the idea of driving economic integration to strengthen democracies is what it's all about. Now, I'll just put a caveat to that, which is not every partner out there is going to fit within that frame. Does it mean that it's not an opportunity for ally shoring? Not necessarily. I think what we have to be clear about is what's the fundamental set of rules that drive an ally shoring opportunity. So, could we get there with a country like the DRC, where we have tremendous need for cobalt and they're pretty much the sole supplier? Could we get there with, some of the countries in South America, Bolivia, for example, with their huge lithium stores? Maybe we could. But let's go back to the North American alignment, because I think in some ways it's the closest thing we have to an ally shoring concept that, in my mind, becomes, and this is something Michael Pettis, the economist I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, he wrote Trade Wars or Class Wars. He talks about it as the perfect customs union, this idea of rooting economies in a trade framework that is actually free and open. And that if we're going to break the system, which is kind of what's happening right now, why are we not rebuilding it in a way that is fundamentally aligned with the real open economy concept, as opposed to dealing with the sort of parasitic nature of what we have with China as a market participant who drives non-market practices. That's all to say, like I'm definitely bullish on North America, but extending from there to the Western Hemisphere and broadening out trade engagement in the right way with countries like Brazil, Chile, Argentina. There's been a lot of discussion with Argentina. There are opportunities in Central America as well. There's huge opportunity with Europe, and I'm disappointed with where we are on that conversation because it's such a natural alignment. And quite frankly, I mean, this week the G7 is meeting in Kananaskis, and one of the things that they're going to talk about is whether the G7 wants to take a common position on low value goods coming out of China and tariff levels. To me, this is the most important thing on the G7 agenda. Some others might say it's Ukraine, et cetera, but from an economic perspective, the idea that some of our key allies might get aligned around the idea of pushing back against Chinese dumping, that's strong. And that's where the US and Europe could actually be doing a lot more together. If we could get over some of the other hurdles and some of the hiccups with the rhetoric right now and the NATO conversation, which we can also talk about. I mean, they're not unrelated in the sense that the way that I see what this administration is doing is creating space for something different. The question is, what are we going to create now that we've made this space? What does that look like? And rather than focusing on, well, we hate the idea of tariffs coming from the US, well, what about the opportunity to align in ways that we were not able to do a year ago? You know, both Europe and the US, for the most part, have the same dependency challenges on China. The Europeans are scared to death that all of the overproduction that we're now pushing back because of tariffs will end up on European shores, and they're not wrong. So, why are we not ally shoring on a much broader scale? To be able to create more productive capacity over the long term so that neither Europe nor the US are looking at long term dependencies on Chinese batteries and solar panels and all the other critical implements that we're going to need.
This is very simplistic, but is it safe to say, with all the countries and regions that you just mentioned, with even accounting for a few outliers like DRC and Cobalt, that largely within a allied economy, that there would be enough just pure raw material and resources and food and all of the basic things to create a contained economy? Because the two biggest threats to the free world, at least in common acceptance, is Russia and China.
Yeah.
Europe is heavily dependent on Russia for energy, and China for lots of other things. BYD almost tried to go flood Europe with a bunch of cheap EVs until there was like kind of the last set.
Almost.
Well, they started, but there's been just within the last year or 6 months, there's been some scramble in certain European countries to slow that down and start to ramp up some tariffs.
Yeah.
But is that a simple enough way to say there could be, if you have however many countries there are, how many countries are there? 80 some odd, 180? I don't remember. I only look at this half of the globe and then only at the top. But nevertheless, that you could carve out a large section of the world and largely have a self-contained economy.
So I mean, the way that we could start talking about it, and I mentioned this in some testimony. I gave some congressional testimony a few weeks back around the reauthorization of the State Department, and how do we start thinking about foreign assistance and the role of State Department? And one of the terms that I used was this concept of the near global economy. Near global meaning all those countries that want to play by fair rules, competitive rules, should be part of the near global economy. I would make that connection go one more step, which is a near global economy should be reflective of an ally shoring concept. What does this mean when you get down to the brass tacks of who has what? I think there's a lot of work to be done around that. For example, could the US help solve Europe's energy dependency on Russia? I think we're already doing some of that through LNG. We could probably be doing more. Could the US help solve agricultural issues that may face, European partners or others? Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have to do a better job of looking at the critical supply chains, where the equities are, who holds the IP around critical capacity, where we need to innovate our way out of IP that we don't have. I mean, it's really a big set of questions. What I like about the ally shoring framework or even the concept of the near global economy is it gives us a way to start thinking about what the new umbrella should look like. And then there's a whole lot of work to be done to figure out what the new alignment should be. Some of that is going to come naturally as Brussels decides that, you know what, they can't create the same dependency on Russia in China. So maybe they need to start working more with the US and others to create co production around EV batteries so we can get to scale together. Maybe we need to combine our IP efforts, again, to be able to move out of a lithium ion battery into something that has less reliance on critical minerals, therefore less reliance on China, where they're dominating. So these are questions that we face together, and we need a frame for how to have these conversations and to do it pretty quickly. Otherwise, we're going to end up in this system that's breaking apart, like Zihan talks about, and it's kind of happening, but without a strategy for how to go forward. And that is a waste of US leadership European leadership. It's a waste of our dominance as consumers to the world. It's not good use of US dollar hegemony. Frankly, it's not setting us up for the American prosperity model that we need going forward. So there's a huge play around reindustrialization. So I don't mean to in any way suggest that that play should be limited. It shouldn't. We should reindustrialize wherever we can. But there are going to be instances where we cannot. And it's going to be driven by where the resources are, or the capacities, or the IP. But I do think it's a lot easier to look at some of these problems together, especially with the Europeans and the Japanese and the Australians, and maybe a handful of others, of course, our North American partners, and create scale for ourselves. That's really the key.
You said two things earlier. I like to connect them and see what you think. You said, well, oh, fundamentally, we're looking at a conflict between authoritarian political structures versus the free world. 99% of the discourse around these topics falls into American left-right political continuum boxes.
Mhm.
Can you talk to us about the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, where you work, and the organization's history and its efforts and success or failure in trying to transcend the American continuum of discourse such that these conversations can become the dominant
Mhm.
point of discussion?
We should go back to 9/11, which was the point at which the conversations were starting in Washington about the need for a different kind of think tank, one that would look at emerging threat actors that weren't necessarily state actors, but non-state actors, terrorist threats. And that's, of course, what 9/11 made clear, that we had a new type of enemy we needed to think about, that we weren't tooled properly to deal with a certain kind of asymmetric threat that was really testing us. And FDD was really born out of that idea that we needed to rethink our foreign policy to defend democratic principles from adversaries that were taking on different form, and that we needed to punch back pretty hard. So we're an independent, nonpartisan think tank. We are fully focused on foreign policy, although domestic and foreign policy is really beginning to converge in interesting ways, which is kind of to your point and question. So over the years, I would say we've been best known as a think tank for work on sanctions, countering illicit finance, going hard after America's adversaries from Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and Cuba to North Korea and others, all of whom kind of fall in the same space, which is authoritarian states with malintent towards the US. Now, a few years ago, about the time that I was coming to FDD in a full-time capacity, I've been working with them since about 2014, more in an advisory role. But when I came to the foundation a few years ago to run what's called the Center on Economic and Financial Power, we had some really deep discussions about how we needed to think about economic statecraft and economic power going forward. As important as it is to use tools like sanctions and export controls, and let's call them the tools of economic warfare, it's equally important to think about the tools of economic power projection and positive power projection, which we can do through many tools, whether we're talking about foreign direct investment in places like South Africa or DRC or Bolivia or elsewhere, to not what I would call soft power, but what I think we should talk about as smart power, and the way we use the innovation of the American economy to help others in more meaningful ways. PEPFAR is actually a really good example of that, right? The HIV initiative that was launched 25 years ago and has been really, really successful in saving a lot of lives and is now sort of on the chopping block. That's, to me, smart. That's an example of smart power. So, how do we take this unfolding conversation about adversaries versus allies, economic power versus military power, kinetic versus soft? How do we start to make sense of that across this divide within the American electorate and maybe more specifically within Congress, because we sit in Washington and our audience is mostly a policy audience? I don't know that it's getting easier, but I'm not sure that it's getting harder. So let me give you a couple of examples. This whole conversation around reindustrialization and a real focus on the middle class was the Democratic calling card for a long time. Now it's the Republican calling card. So when we go to the Capitol Hill or have a conversation with policymakers elsewhere, and talk about what it means to have a foreign policy that encourages ally shoring, nearshoring, and reshoring. There's an audience for this that cuts across the divide. And when we have a conversation about transparency and the role of anti corruption in supporting free markets and symmetry of information that allows for capital to flow and pushes back against China's BRI model, we get an audience across the political divide. So I really feel that within this conversation around economic security, there is the opportunity to bring in so many more Americans. And that's what we need to do. Again, our work is focused on policymakers, but we try to publish in Newsweek, we try to publish in the New York Post and places where we get a wider audience so we can start talking about these things in ways that are more meaningful to people who don't spend their time thinking about them, but feel the impact and maybe don't know quite how to navigate that or articulate the concern. And recognizing that there's a lot of polarization right now and a lot of rhetoric that's hitting people both the right way and the wrong way on can we clear it aside to talk about what it means to build prosperity and what good foreign policy means for that, which is well beyond the conversation of cost cutting, et cetera. There are people who break and people who build, right? Sometimes you have to break before you can rebuild.
Let me frame this a little bit because the people
Yeah.
who build, I also will call back when you were talking about ally shoring, about creating one job in Mexico that then creates a job in the U.S. I think a lot of the crux is that in general, wealth disparity in the US has gotten terrible,
Yep.
since the 70s. And it's hard for me, and I am sure even worse for people who work in the trades or are builders to entertain the idea, especially at a moment where a lot of the pieces are moving around and thus a lot of opportunity is being created to be very amenable to the idea of going, well, let's move a factory out of China and move it to Venezuela or even Mexico and China is obviously, or excuse me, Apple and China is in the news because of McGee's book and a lot of this stuff. But at the end of all of those conversations, what I hear from people is, well, there's no way you could build an iPhone in the US. It would cost $3,500. It would cost $3,000 because of labor. And even if you had the factories and all of that. And that's where my brain starts to short circuit because I don't feel like that is a fair read of the situation. You obviously, especially if you're Apple and you have a couple of $1 trillion in cash sitting around, could start to build an iPhone in the United States, especially if you factor in automation or other things like that. So, why is it not that simple? A bunch of big corporations offshored the jobs because labor was cheaper. And now they're saying, well, labor is still too expensive, so we can't bring it back. I don't feel like that is an acceptable answer to a huge swath of our populace.
Yeah, I don't think that's acceptable either. I really don't. I mean, I think we have to look at the policies that were incentivizing companies like Apple to make the decisions they made. Yeah, I mean, labor costs are an issue for sure. But if you look at how labor costs are rising in China, I mean, they're getting less competitive in that regard. China knows it too. And a lot of companies are already, either relocating or rethinking where am I going next for more competitive labor rates. Structure is a challenge, right? As long as the capital is incentivized to go elsewhere, that will probably continue to happen. So I think we have some really hard decisions to make about what it means to incentivize capital to come home and to seed the industrial plant that we need going forward. And this is where we get a little bit lost. I mean, we can't. I think the iPhone story is what it is. It's instructive because look at what happened. We made China. we trained China. We're not training our own people, but we're training China. We're not getting a lot of credit for that, at least in a foreign policy context, which is also a little maddening. Like, really? You know? Now you want to cut off our rare earths. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm with you. Like the prosperity model for this country going forward has to include more productive capacity, and we need to be focused on the jobs that are needed in the future. And I don't mean like 20 years. I mean like in the next 5 to 10 years. That day is really already here, but we have the capacity within our educational systems to pivot, to retrain, to do it in a more comprehensive way. But it starts by bringing the capital back home to make all this happen. And in some cases, we're going to need tariffs. Right now, we have blanket tariffs, but we're going to need even more work done on strategic tariffs to be able to seed these industries properly. Critical minerals is a good example of that. But look, the reality is that we're still going to have more processed minerals coming in from elsewhere than we are going to process at home. It's just the way it's going to be. So I think we also have to temper the expectation that everything is coming home. That's probably not how it's going to work out, but more needs to come home. And that needs to be done in a way that secures the middle class of this country, right? I grew up in Detroit. During that painful period in the 80s and into the 90s, we continued to watch the hollowing of that manufacturing base. There was some innovation going on for sure, but I mean, you listen to my parents talk about Detroit in the 50s and the 60s. It's not a city that I would have recognized from my own upbringing, and that needs to be the story of the past as well. It can't be the story of the future. What does it look like going forward? How do we get the capital here? How do we keep it here? And how do we incentivize more capital? I mean, I do think that this administration is moving in that direction. There was a really interesting document that came out a few months ago called the America First Investment Policy. It came out on a Friday night, okay, in the midst of many other things happening. And I read the document like over that weekend, thought, holy crap, like this is great. This document actually talks about Russia as one of our foreign adversaries. And, it was around about the time that we were sort of telling Ukraine that they were the problem. And so you have this sort of strange thing going on where, there's rhetoric over here, but then when you like look under the hood, there's a lot more activity going on that's actually pretty interesting. Anyway, the America First investment policy talks about the guardrails around receiving direct investment into the U.S. What does that look like? How should we be thinking about that? How do we limit Chinese investment that becomes corrosive to our economy or from other adversarial nations? How do we think about, building out the right framework so we capture the real value? It is really one of the most important policy memos that has come out in this administration, and it deserves more scrutiny and more thinking to make sure that it doesn't just sit on the margins. So as we begin to see these floods of foreign direct investment from all over the place, right? From the Saudis, from the Emiratis, from the Japanese, from others, that we're thinking through the ownership and the IP issues as we go, and being smart about it. But it's interesting. Peter Zeihan, going back to his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning. I guess it's a bit of a spoiler alert, but at the end of the book, he talks about it was a fallacy to think that the last 80 years were really the age of America, the golden age. Maybe it's just beginning. I think if we play our cards right, I think that's true.
I do think there's a ton of opportunity. Like I find myself as a lifelong, Democrat, basically, seeing a lot of stuff coming out of the Trump administration that I really do agree with. I often think what we're seeing is there are different classes of people within the administration, and there's one lens that is implementing a lot of economic and policy decision, and it kind of gets wrapped up into isolationism at the same time, and those don't always need to be there. Like, for instance, direct foreign investment could be great if it were guided towards building factories in the U.S. and capital, improvements. But it's just all been very binary, where it should have been a lot more targeted.
Yeah.
To that end, though, a question that I have for you, because you have a much better understanding of the history of things, as does, I'm sure, FDD from 2001 on. A big mystery for me has been why, when we had things like COVID, where we had the supply chain highly disrupted for the better part of 2 years and still, a little messed up today, why isn't there at a kind of NatSec strategic level implementation of a policy that is I call it like a one of each policy, where it's like, this industry we don't actually want to do. We're largely going to import these things, but we want to have the footprint from a capability standpoint let alone a raw material or industrial standpoint. Why does everyone freak out about it when there's a crisis, but
Yeah.
over the last 20 or 30 years, not actually make an investment on that level because another COVID, some sort of cybersecurity threat, just a global depression where shipping is not as efficient anymore. There's plenty of scenarios that you can imagine
Yep.
where we would need to be making our own stuff and we're not. Why? Do
Yeah,
you have any sense of why that is?
I do. I'll give you my take on it. So we're in a hot economic war. I think we've been here for quite some time. I would struggle to tell you the date certain when it started, but it's no doubt we're in it. We're in this war without the equivalent of an economic Pentagon. I think what you're describing is a reflection of the scattershot approach within the US government and within policymaking generally about how we look at these threats, how we think about our competencies, our strategic dependencies, and our opportunities. It's going to be really hard for us to connect the dots unless we start restructuring how we think about it. In my testimony a couple weeks ago in the House, I was talking a little bit about this idea of restructuring, right? Whether we're talking about State Department, Commerce, Treasury, Homeland, there are many parts of the US government that are implicated in moving to a model of economic statecraft where we actually anticipate what our challenges are, and we have one set of critical supply chains rather than five different models coming from five different agencies. We just have to clean it up. And it's actually not unlike what we were facing after 9/11. I was part of the stand up at the Department of Homeland Security, or what became DHS, and we had 13 different procurement systems. We had 22 agencies, and it was a big hot mess. It's not exactly the same right now, but the threat has changed without the functions and the structures change. So, I mean, if we look at State Department in particular, there's a complete revamping going on. The question is it going to be remade for the moment? And that's where we need to get ahead of this because we actually need people in government who are wargaming on the economic side. People who understand where our productive capacities are lagging. So, to your point about we need one of each, have those critical supply chains been identified? And what's the resilience strategy to make sure that the stockpile is there, whether we're talking about supporting the defense industrial base or civilian supply chains that are absolutely critical if we're in another global shock like a COVID or something worse?
Do you think part of that is just that we've had a major over reliance the market? Like we just kind of presume the efficiencies of the market will cause these holes to be patched over, and it just never has. And we have a national allergy to big federal directed programs. Like, is that a big factor in play, or is it just more short sightedness?
No, I think it's more about misunderstanding the environment that we were living in, and the fact that we've had this geostrategic competitor that is China that is so distortive in terms of the market practices and the way that it now commands control over a lot of critical supply chains from batteries to, pharmaceuticals, that we misunderstood that relationship. For me, it's at the heart of these dependencies and why we find ourselves where we are. We can work our way out of our challenges with other countries much more easily than we can with China. But I think we fundamentally misunderstood that threat. And because we didn't start thinking about it until more recently in a more comprehensive way, we're still operating with old structures. But, we really should have a function either at the National Security Council or somewhere associated with the White House that's much more of a coordination and even maybe some operational functions around figuring out what the response is going to be to not only something like, does China invade Taiwan and what's our sanctions strategy, but what do we do if China signs a security agreement with X number of countries in Latin America and we need to rethink our dependencies there? I mean, there's so many different scenarios that need to be planned for in order to address what you're talking about with more specificity. Otherwise, we're just going to find ourselves flat-footed, and we have all this economic power, but we're not set up in a way that allows us to really make use of it. So when we spend political capital and other kinds of capital on sanctions and sanctions enforcement, and we don't get the right outcome, we're wasting our resources. We're wasting taxpayer dollars. When we put export controls that are evaded because it's easy for people to get around it by working through other partners, we're wasting our economic power. That has to stop. Otherwise, we're going to lose.
When I was, in at NYU, oh my god, 1993, I remember that, the book that we read was End of History, Fukuyama's book. At that time, it was presented to us as conflict is over. The default setting is the system that America leads. That's the default setting. And this is what, I don't know, 10 years before the beginning of the China's hockey stick. I reread the book recently, but there doesn't seem to be a component that refers to that talks about what happens if I don't want to say a bad actor, but if an actor just doesn't want to play inside the boundaries of that paradigm. Thinking about this, you brought this up to me in a really huge way when you said we don't have an economic Pentagon. If on one pole in authoritarian regimes you have the Chinese hyper centralized, verticalized industrial policy, and the other end you have our decentralized, kind of oscillating policies based on who is elected to the highest office. What is the optimal organization that would determine such an industrial policy? Because Japan had, what was it, MIDI, the Ministry of Mi-
Yeah, I don't remember what it stands for, but
International
yes, but
There are
Trade something.
commercial level.
195
Right. Okay.
countries. I'm just
Okay. So,
reestablishing our bona
okay.
fides. Okay.
So I'm looking. Wait. Let's see here. Okay. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, founded 1949. So founded in the wake of World War II, they clearly had to take action to get their hockey stick going. They eventually reached a state where they did no longer needed it, or it was merged into other functions. In the United States, what is the optimal org at what level? And how might we get there given the oscillations of our policies between left and right?
I think there's some imperative to build this structure soon, so that we have a chance to get it rooted and before we go into another election cycle, no matter what the outcome is. So I think this is like a job for today. And I would probably broadly describe it as industrial policy with American characteristics. So something a little bit lighter than the 5-year plan, something that is just, I mean, from a conceptual level, much more focused on the power of the market and the ability to bring capital in to solve big problems more effectively and to move markets in ways that are more meaningful for preserving democracies, especially our own. So, in terms of what does that organizational function or structure look like, I do think that there's a coordinating body required at a pretty high level across all of the agencies and departments that are implicated. And then from that, we need to make sure that the structuring of the risk assessment and the use of tools and engagement is much more coordinated. And we're talking about a very broad range of tools. We're talking about everything from investment in critical mines and minerals in Africa to tools that help us stop Chinese and Russian oligarchs from buying up real estate in Miami. Like it's that big, right? When we think about how to use our economic toolkit. We actually just did a graphic on this. For anybody who's interested, if you go to fdd.org and search for tools of economic security, it should come up. And we basically put all of the economic tools that we could think of into a series of buckets or gears to show, and we grouped them by sanctions, by trade tools, anti-corruption tools, et cetera. So you can get a full view about what it means to have a toolkit around economic statecraft, economic warfare, economic security. And it will give you an idea of the breadth of the challenge here with respect to how we're structured. But we need to have a much tighter engagement between the departments that have the tool set, right, and have responsibility for how they're utilized. So Treasury's use of sanctions, Commerce's use of export controls, State Department's use of anti-corruption activity, and many more examples into the sort of legislative framework that Congress probably needs to lay down with a little bit more specificity. So we may need some legislation to create some of these new structures, and then there's some that can be broken down and gotten rid of that probably aren't needed anymore. But I think the most important thing is a common understanding of the challenges that we face. We're in an economic moment, and it's going to last for a long, long time. We're also in a kinetic moment now with Iran and elsewhere. which adds lots of complications to the picture. But at the end of the day, it's the fundamentals of the global economy that drive security and prosperity. So there's a lot to think through. So I'm not sure I have a full answer to it, but I think there's important steps that we can take now to start building that framework and to keep it moving. And we're going to have to adjust this as we go. We're in some new territory here. But just like the Department of Defense has an integrated structure that allows them to change tactics when they need to, but keeps everything coordinated, we need to be thinking about our economic power more in that way.
For the people who are radicalized about reindustrialization, we've been talking a lot at a global order or at a federal level, but flip it. Like, where do you think the best application of appeal and power for people that are representing US manufacturers is in DC right now? Should they be writing policy? Should they be lobbying? Should they be innovating new financial structures that could facilitate factory building? Like, where do you see the best places to apply energy?
There's a couple of conversations that really matter right now. One is what do states and localities need to be able to take the interest in capital for new industrial development and make that happen? What's required? Is a subsidy required? Is a tariff required? Is there a role for the Exim bank to do some lending guarantees? Is there a role for the Development Finance Corporation? Political risk insurance to help companies that want to build out supply chains and have to get some of that material from abroad. It's a complicated set of topics, and I think it depends on where you sit and what you're interested in. But I think this conversation about what do companies and owners of capital investors need to make the right kinds of investments in the US? What's standing in the way? That has to be understood by policymakers so we don't end up with some wonky set of things. Like, I'll give you an example. Like I think it's in the One Big Beautiful Bill, there's a rollback on the 45X tax credit, which is a detriment to all of the upstart critical mineral processors who need 5 years to figure out how to get to get the write-off for 5 years to make the investments work. I mean, stuff like that. Like, we're going to offer a tax credit for 4 years, but lop off the fifth year for a marginal savings and then screw over an industry. You know, that just doesn't make sense. So pointing out those real pain points is really, really important. The second thing that I want to talk about is just going back to the issue of labor and workforce development. One thing that this administration really wants to do, and I think it's the right thing to do, is build more ships, right? For defense purposes, for commercial purposes. Now, to do that, we need tech from places like Japan and Korea, as you well know, maybe from Europe, but we also need the skilled workforce. And right now, even if we wanted to start building more ships tomorrow, we probably couldn't because we don't have the capacity. The Merchant Marine Academy has been hollowed out and underfunded for so many years that they can't provide what they were intended to provide, which is a workforce for the maritime industry. So why are we not plussing up the Maritime Academy? Why are we holding grants back there? And this is where, for these critical sectors where people are really trying to get new production models up and running, go to Congress with that conversation. I think that's really important. And there are probably associations out there who are looking at pieces of the puzzle, new associations that are started around the reindustrialization conversation. The Chamber of Commerce is probably helpful in some of this. So there's opportunities to get engaged with other conversations that are happening, but also just to go directly to members because they're also searching for the answers. Nobody wants to come out against helping American manufacturers.
There is a guy on Twitter, John Conrad, who's a former ship captain. You follow him as well, like so. And he every time he talks about this exact problem, the merchant marine being under supported, he gets like hate messages, public hate messages from like some standing naval officers, and it's incredible. Like, why is there this institutional pushback on this? This is just the unsexy arm.
I don't get that. I don't know. I mean, I can't fathom why that would be coming from a naval officer. I mean,
I caught it. You can't fathom it. Uh, there's a problem. A perception of what manufacturing jobs are, should be, what they look like in the future versus the vision that people have in the at the head in the past. Military and or sort of like federally funded jobs programs versus local programs. Like I think that's one of the core questions of all of reindustrialization is what jobs are we actually talking about? And when we call them skilled trades, does that mean we need, master welders that have shipbuilding experience, or does it mean really we need one tick up from like entry level factory worker? I don't
Yeah.
think there's a lot of nuance around that, and it's why I think some of these conversations get bogged down. Is that everybody looks at it in the economic aggregate and are starting to slice into some of these specifics. That one alone makes a lot of sense to me. If the Zionist viewpoint is that the ability to hold the water or the shipping lanes open is a core component of American economic power. Sure would be nice if we made our own ships too, wouldn't it? Elaine Dezenski serves as the senior director and head of the Center of Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan and fiercely independent think tank focused on national security and foreign policy. Elaine, I feel like we just scratched the surface, so we're going to have you back, but this is a great conversation.
I would love to. And keep up the great work. I love Tool or Die. So I'm really happy to be here. And thank you again.